Thanks for joining us. I wanted to reach out. We are having more requests than ever from groups that are really taking a hard look at fundraising. So they're thinking about how can they bring in more revenue? How can they bring in different revenue? How can they replace revenue that they've lost? So I immediately thought of you as someone that's good to chat with on those topics.
Yes, happy to chat.
Can you introduce yourself, please?
Charity Jovanovic, co-founder of Heart in the Cloud. I founded Heart in the Cloud in 2020 with the idea of bringing the science of fundraising to all organizations. I have 20 years of development experience, specializing in prospect development, technology, and everything behind the science of fundraising.
So, one question we get a lot is I'm a leader of a nonprofit. How do I find new donors? Where are they? How do I find them? What should I be looking for? So, how do you advise organizations on where to look for donors?
So, Ellie, that sounds like a question as old as time, and you'd think that it's a very simple question. But when I think of that question, I want to turn it just a little bit on its head of not just how do I find donors, but how do I find the best donors? Because it's the same thing. And I would start by saying that your best donor is your current donor. So, no matter how small or how new you are of an organization, I would always recommend to start by looking at your current donors first. And you don't need to have sophisticated tools or methodology, but you could use whatever data you have to spot any patterns or trends to be able to say, oh, look, this person's been giving every year for 10 years, etc. And I would start there. And then I would radiate out. And I always say never go to Antarctica. So never start with cold prospects that you're not sure if you have connections, you're not sure if they have a track record of giving to an organization like yours. But you would start with your current donors. And then you would go from there to your champions. Do you have a champion donor? Do you have a strong board that would be willing to make introductions? Or do you just have connections in your own local network that you would go to? And then from there, you could relationship map. And again, you don't need sophisticated tools to be able to say, okay, well, here's a list of people that we think we could go to next. And then if you're in the context where you do really need to find new donors, either because you're growing or you've tapped out your current network and current donor base, I would say at a bare minimum, you need to put a little bit of thought into who really are the best new donors that we can find. So what do I mean by that? It's, for example, you help with housing in your local community. And what you do is you tend to make sure that there are legal contracts that are accurate for tenants who are looking for housing. Well, maybe your best donor are lawyers, for example. So thinking about like, who is that best donor? Who would be interested in giving to your organization? That's a very easy approach to finding that new donor. And a couple of steps before that would be understanding, well, why would somebody give to our organization? And once you understand the why, I think it's easy to understand who would be what I call like the best in class donor. So you may or may not have connections to them, but you would really want to have them learn about your organization. And then once you've built that list, it's easy to, again, put some methodology behind it to figure out, well, do I have connections? Am I going to bump into that person at a conference? Things like that. I think that's just a really simple way of saying, go out there and connect the dots between your work and that best donor that you want to find in the future.
That's really helpful. I want to circle back to what you said at the start, what you were saying in the beginning about your best donor is your current donor. I think I'm reading between the lines there that means that a lot of times organizations have more room to grow with a donor than they're already covering, or there's more upside with a donor than they anticipated. And I think the other thing I'm reading between the lines is a lot of times groups might not be great at retaining their current donors. When you work with organizations, do you find those two things?
Yes. So we find either they have really great retention, but it's a bit of plug and play. So every year they ask for the same amount from their current donor pool, and they don't necessarily think about, oh, well, maybe this donor is ready to give more, or it doesn't necessarily need to be more money, but maybe it's more frequently. Like they have donors. I've seen that where for whatever reason, donor giving is like every other year with the organization, just depending on their fundraising programs and practices. And maybe it's about getting people to give every year or twice a year. So it doesn't necessarily have to be about giving more. Obviously, there's a lot of ROI if you can, in your current donor pool, identify who could give more and who ideally would be a major gift donor, so someone who could give more significant funding to your organization. But I see that a lot. And I think what's interesting is if you focus on that, like who can we get to invest more, you actually see better donor retention rates because you're thinking about the donors more holistically and how to engage them more consistently.
I like the point you were making that upside and retention can actually go together. So the more you're engaging with someone, you're leaning in, they're making bigger investments. Maybe actually the more likely are to stay with your organization because they're interacting with you in a way that means more to them and to you. And so it sounds like there's some nice win-wins sometimes.
Yes. And I've seen situations where you've identified someone as a major gift donor and say they're a regular annual giving donor. You've identified them and you engage them more. And sometimes they'll say no to the major gift, but they actually give more consistently and a little bit more. Maybe it's not at the major gift level, but it does ramp up their engagement because you've reached out, you've shown that you've seen them, and you've acknowledged their giving and thanked them for their giving. So you might not get the upside you wanted, but you usually do get better engagement from the donor.
And then can you talk a little bit more about the personas and the best in class donors? So it sounds like that's where you don't know someone, but you're figuring out who might be interested in the work that we do. So at Bridgespan, we talk about natural match. So you're trying to look for somewhat of a natural match between the work that you do and what the funder cares about. And that's, I think I really like the example of housing that you talk through. You said lawyers might make sense there. And was that because it's an organization that does something related to the law, so lawyers would understand it? So can you talk a little bit more about, for an organization that wants to find those right personas, how they should be doing that?
Yes, and this is Heart in the Clouds bread and butter. So when we help organizations identify new prospects, cold prospects, we often spend a lot of time in what we call discovery work, interviewing the organization, understanding how they talk about their work, why would someone fund, who are their best donors, what are their best donors, current best donors like. And then we come up with three, maybe maximum five different personas around those conversations. And some of them are very classic and obvious, right? So if you are a legal aid society, lawyers. And some of them are a bit out of the box where it's like, okay, you're a local community organization. You had a lot of first and second generation immigrant families that come and have your services. A lot of those immigrant families in your market end up being small business owners like that, like a good portion of them. So maybe you want to start looking for small business owners in your market, and that would be a great donor persona for you to look at. That's where prospect research and kind of knowing where to find data comes in handy because sometimes that's a very difficult donor persona to prospect against. Because for a lot of organizations, especially if you're not a university or a hospital, you don't have that built-in constituency. You don't have alumni who experience your program. It's about thinking about, well, who would understand, who would have that connection to the work that you do?
Great. Great. And I think you described this is discovery. So these are you're identifying these personas to find people that you're not in relationship with yet,
Exactly.
but you're going to hopefully find a reason to reach out. And you think that even though it's cold outreach, that it's really kind of a little bit warm because you know that something your organization does intersects with something that this person's likely to care about.
Exactly. And I can also speak to what you may not want to do right away, right? So a lot of people will just go straight to the business journal, straight to Fortune 500, straight to Forbes to cherry pick, and those are great sources once you already know who you're looking for. But I think when cold prospecting doesn't work out is because the donor, especially if you've managed to make contact with the donor and you don't have a really strong reason as to why they landed on your list. Or if you bring this list to your board and it's clear that you didn't put a lot of thought into why this list would make sense. I think that's definitely like a don't do it if you can help it, would be my tip there.
Yep. Yep. That's great. And you're going to where I wanted to go next too, which is that relationship mapping and working with your board. And I think I'm hearing from you that if you're going to your board with a list that's less thought out, it's going to be harder for them to make those phone calls and make those introductions. They may feel more awkward about it because they don't know, gosh, this person, I know they don't actually care about this thing. But have you found that when you give the board members the right lists and that they're willing to make the calls and make introductions and do outreach?
Yes, the way that at least Heart in the Cloud does it is because we've talked about it so much with the organization, they've they've really bought into the personas or the network. And so, for example, another persona that we recently used to prospect for an organization are women executives in finance because of the work that the organization was doing in this specific metro area. And people were excited about that because they understood why this person, even though they might not have had specifically a track record of giving to a similar organization, we understand why I'm going to go out and make this introduction and why it matters. And so I think it's very powerful to have put in a little bit of thought as to like really who is that best donor.
Yep, yep. And it's so interesting that if you go to your board with a really who knows anyone who'd be interested in giving, you go with that really broad open ask. On one hand, this, anything goes, but then it's actually harder to think of suggestions and harder for them to come up with ideas of who to talk to. But when you say we're looking for this specific type, small business owner, that actually helps them get started and think of those people.
Exactly.
Let's switch gears. Charity, could you talk to me a little bit about development operations? I'm asking that given we have a lot of nonprofits coming to us right now who are building out their fundraising function. They're focused more on individuals. What I'm hearing from a lot of people is they first think of the frontline staff. So who's going to be going out, meeting with our donors and making asks? There's a lot to it that's not frontline too, and that's the development operation piece. So what else should these groups be thinking about as they're building out a fundraising team? What is their back office or what should their development operations include?
Just think of development operations as the backbone of fundraising or the champions of the science of fundraising. And I would say, starting at the basics, right? Development operations is gift processing, managing your CRM and the rest of your technology related to fundraising, and kind of knowledge management. Maybe they manage a grant library, maybe they manage your case for support, etc. And then prospect development. Obviously, I saved the best for last. So prospect research, prospect management. And those are the four big functions. At the baseline, you need to have those capabilities in place with your organization. My recommendation is like if you can have a strategic development operations shop, that would be really powerful for your frontline fundraisers. And by strategic, I mean it's a shop where they're set up such that they're driving a lot of insight for your fundraisers around whether that's individual performance metric or organizational fundraising metrics. They're seeing ahead and developing the strategies and systems to be able to be two steps ahead of knowing where the frontline fundraiser is going to go. So what I mean by that, for example, is having a team that can essentially tie your fundraising strategy to your technology. Because oftentimes that's what holds us back is you have this fundraising, very specific, well thought out fundraising strategy, but your technology doesn't match. And so having a team that can operationalize it, meaning they can make sure that the technology is able to enable that frontline work, but also making sure that it runs smoothly day to day so that your frontline fundraisers, all they're doing is what they need to do, focus on the donors and engaging the donors. That would be ideal. And so I would say those are the four capabilities. And, that might mean that it could be one person for some shops.
Great, great. And so you said it could be one person. Let's take that scenario. What are you looking to hire for? What type of person would be good at this?
Someone who's detail oriented, but also like donor oriented in terms of making sure that the donor has a good donor experience. So they're just not heads down in the data, but they're understanding, no, I want to make sure that the gifts are processed as fast as possible, because if they're processed accurately as fast as possible, the donor gets thanked as fast as possible and then gets put on a good stewardship.
And then what would it look like with a team that's slightly larger? So not a huge development, operations shop, but what is a middle size that you could recommend for an organization?
say someone focused on gift processing, someone focused on your CRM, and then someone focused on prospect research. Those are the three that I would recommend for a smaller or medium-sized shop.
Can you talk about how you work with organizations to help put all these pieces together?
Yeah, so Heart in the Cloud essentially can plug into any of those pieces. So if you need prospect development support, if you need CRM support, Heart in the Cloud can support you, but we can also help you operationalize everything. I'm hearing a lot of organizations right now thinking about whether or not it's time to switch CRMs. And that question in and of itself, we can help you with in terms of assessing, are you currently using your CRM full functionality? Does its functionality actually map out to what your business needs are? Sometimes the answer is, actually, no, you're not using all of the functionality, and it's because you have it all turned on, but you need more training. And if you need more training, we can actually help with that as well. Or sometimes it is, no, right now your CRM is not a match. There are some core business needs that your CRM just can't address. And so we can actually help you select an ideal CRM. And then in terms of when you think of the frontline fundraising donor moves management cycle, we can plug into there. So we talked about identifying new prospects. We've talked about engaging them and making the right ask. That requires some thoughtful prospect research and then thinking through your donor segments in terms of doing some analyses or reporting around, okay, finding the best donors, who do we want to focus on this year with what strategies?
This has been a fun conversation. Thank you. I've learned a lot. It feels both you've given me interesting things to think about and some tactical, good action items that I can bring to some of the groups that I work with. So thank you so much for the time today.
Thank you, Ali. I hope it was helpful. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.